Hello again. This is the part 2 of my lecture on the connection between personality traits and leadership. If you haven't watched the part 1 of this video series, I would recommend that you watch that first before watching this one. Though you would still benefit watching this video directly because I'm covering different aspects of personality in these videos. But the first video will provide you the foundation of why personality traits matter in context of leadership. And I also go over certain personality traits connection with leadership. In this video, I will be primarily focusing on the Big Five personality factor model and the connection of those Big Five personality traits with leadership. Towards the end of the video, I will touch upon the Hexaco model as well, and talk about the connection of the sixth factor that is discussed in the Hexaco model and the connection of that sixth factor with leadership. So what are those big five personality traits? Well, you can see them here in this diagram. They are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These five traits combined form the big five personality factor model. And it's very important that you not only understand what these factors mean, but also remember these personality traits. Not just from the exam perspective, though that would be important for you, but from a very practical perspective. If you understand what these big five personality traits are, it will give you deep insights into the nature of different people, including yourself. If you know how you are placed on these different dimensions, how somebody else with whom you are interacting is placed on these five personality dimensions, you essentially have a deeper knowledge about this person. You have greater insights about the person's pattern of thinking, about the person's pattern of feeling, as well as the pattern of behaving. And then, of course, you will be more effective in your interactions. You would remember that we define leadership as the process of influencing others to attain some common goal. Now, if you understand others really well, the people whom you are trying to influence, if you understand them really well, then of course, you would be able to modify your approach according to their personality traits. You can realize how then you will be more effective in your interaction. In this video though, I will be talking about personality traits more from the perspective of the leader. In other words, depending on where you stand on these dimensions, how effective or ineffective will you be as a leader? Now, given that these traits are really important, I should mention that that's a very easy way to remember these five traits, and that's the acronym OCEAN. O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extraversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. Now, why do we call these five traits as the big five personality traits? Is it because some famous psychologist thought that these are the five most important traits when it comes to understanding human beings? Some famous psychologist came up with this list? No, because if we go that route, everyone will have their own list, right? When you come up with a list, you may come up with these 5 traits. Somebody else may think some another set of 5 traits which that person thinks is extremely important, right? So we will not have agreement on what are those 5 most important traits. So the way these 5 traits came into being is actually through a very organic process. And by that, what I mean is that researchers working in the area of personality, when they analyzed data that they had collected over decades, over several decades, and they ran that data through a statistical process called factor analysis, these are the 5 traits that always emerged through that analysis. And this happened not just in any one study, but in several studies across different disciplines. So when educational psychologists, for instance, are analyzing personality data, they find that these 5 traits are the ones that are always emerging in the factor analysis. When clinical psychologists, they are working on a different set of data, again, they come up with the same set of 5 personality traits. When social psychologists or organizational psychologists or industrial psychologists are working on their respective sets of data, everyone is coming up with these same set of 5 factors, right? So that is the reason we have come to realize that there are these 5 factors that explain the maximum amount of variance in people's behavior, in their way of thinking, in their way of feeling. So that is the reason we give a lot of importance to these 5 personality traits. I will explain the idea of factor analysis as well. I think you will be able to appreciate what I mean by that, because the factor analysis, if you are not familiar with statistics, may seem like some extremely complex process. Well, the statistical analysis part is complex, but the basic conception of the process is not necessarily that complex. So I will explain that in the next couple of slides. To appreciate factor analysis, let's take a look at this list of adjectives that could be used to describe people. This is not some official list, by the way. I just did a search on the internet, image search for adjectives for people, and that's what I found. So you have it here. Well, if I asked you to rate yourselves on each of these adjectives, say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 meaning this particular adjective describes you perfectly, that's who you really are, and 1 meaning it's not at all like you, okay, that's just the opposite of who you are, then how would you rate yourselves on these adjectives? Okay, if I analyze your responses, I may notice certain patterns. Now, what do I mean by that? Say you rated yourself very high for the word amusing. You gave yourselves maybe 9 or 10 points there. So you are a very amusing person. Then if I look through the other adjectives, I may see certain patterns there. You may then have maybe have rated yourselves fairly high for the word attractive. Maybe you would have rated yourselves very high for the word charming. You would have rated yourselves very high probably again for the word confident. Again, likely very high for words like easygoing, maybe even energetic, exciting. So we are seeing some patterns here. We may see that you rated yourselves very high for humorous, as a likable person, and so on and so forth. I don't necessarily have to go through the maybe, well, I can see talkative. Okay, so we may see certain patterns here. We may see some patterns in the negative direction as well. For example, if you rated yourselves very high for the word amusing, then it is likely that you rated yourself really low for on the word boring, right? You are an amusing person, meaning that you are not a boring person. So we end up seeing a pattern here. Now, if I do a similar kind of analysis, let's say for the second word here, which is what? Angry. So if you rated yourselves very high for the word angry, then probably you rated yourselves very high also for the word cruel. Maybe again, pretty high for dangerous. What else? Maybe again, very high or relatively high for the word horrible, for the word inconsiderate, and so on and so forth, right? So we are seeing some kind of pattern here. And when we analyze such patterns from the data that we have collected from a large group of people, we usually end up with 5 factors. And those 5 factors are those big 5 personality traits factors that I just mentioned. So, of course, depending on the analysis, you may get 10 factors or just 3 factors. Depends on how deep you want to do the analysis. But 5 factors seem to explain the maximum amount of variance in the personality traits of people. So if we make it 6 factors, the additional variance that 6 factors would explain is very marginal, maybe less than 1%. So hey, it is not worth having 6 factors. Following me? But if we reduce the factors from 5 to 4, then we are, let's say, missing out on 5% or maybe 10% of the variance in personality traits. So 5 factors seem to be a ideal number in terms of the descriptive value that they provide for different personality traits. So that's how we came up with the idea of big 5 personality traits. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned, there seems to be a high consensus across different fields. So we can trust this big 5 personality factors. Remember, reliability and validity, some of the terms that we had discussed before. Now, if multiple studies from multiple disciplines give the same results, then we can trust that data, that result very much, right? So that's a strong reliability. So we are getting consistently same pattern of results across multiple studies. In any case, that's how we came up with the idea of the big 5 personality traits. Now we will go through each of those big 5 personality traits in greater detail. But before I do that, I must mention that each of these big 5 factors could be studied from a very broad overall level, or one could go in depth and study the many sub-dimensions that also exist within each of these 5 factors. So most textbooks, of course, talk about these factors, each of these factors from a broad overall level, from a bird's eye view perspective, right? If, for instance, we are talking about openness, because ocean, so O is the first letter. So if we talk about openness first, they will give a broad definition about what openness is. But if we want to delve deeper, we will find that openness actually has many sub-dimensions. So there are 2 different models, almost similar to each other, but each of those models have 6 sub-dimensions within each of those factors. Each of those 5 factors have 6 subdimensions. We call them facets. And some of the recent research actually has tried to find a healthy medium between these two extremes. And that has 2 subdimensions or 2 facets within each factor. Now, given the time constraints, I won't delve deeper into all the 6 facets in my presentation here, but I will at least mention those names so that you have some general idea about what some of those subdimensions are, okay, when you are talking about any of those big 5 personality factors. So we will start first with openness. Openness is short for openness to experience. And openness is the tendency to be informed, creative, insightful, and curious. So people who tend to be high on the openness personality trait, they tend to be curious individuals. They like to learn new things, or they may like to learn more about whatever it is that they are learning. They like to go deeper. And because of this, they may be actually very well informed about the matter that they are interested in. They may also have then some interesting insights about their subject of interest, right? Because of how much deep they are really interested in going. These people, they tend to be creative individuals. They like engaging in creative activities. They tend to be imaginative. So that's what we broadly mean by the openness dimension. Of course, we can go deeper, and if we do that, we come up with these 6 facets of openness. Again, I won't delve deep into each of these facets, but I will touch upon each of these facets so that you will get some idea about how this openness dimension may get manifested in real life, right? So one of the facets is imagination, fantasy. People who score high on imagination or fantasy, they like engaging in imagination. They like fantasizing about things. They may have, good imagination. This may manifest in form of they being, very creative authors or artists. But even scientists may be very imaginative. For example, Albert Einstein was extremely imaginative. He could imagine himself sitting on a beam of light and traveling at the speed of light, which ultimately helped him come up with these theories of relativity, right? So these people, they like engaging in these imagination. Their imaginative ability may vary, but we are talking about the tendency to engage in imagination. People who are low on this facet will prefer not engaging in imagination. They would prefer concrete stuff. They would prefer working on factual material, right? Like an accountant who may just like to work on factual data. Okay. So the second subdimension is artistic interest. So they are really interested in art. Again, we are not talking about artistic abilities because abilities is a different aspect. So that may be related to your abilities or intelligence, those, or your skill level. Those things are different. Here we are talking about your preferences, and these people tend to prefer artistic pursuits. They like the aesthetics, and consequently they like to engage in activities that have artistic value or have aesthetic value. They tend to be in touch with their feelings. They tend to be very expressive with their feelings. For example, they may wear a certain color outfit to express certain emotions. They may wear colorful clothes. So that's another way that this may manifest. They tend to be adventurous. Um, in other words, they like to experience new things. They may like to travel to new places, uncommon places. So somebody who is low on adventurousness may still like to travel, but may prefer going to the same place, right? But if you are high on adventurousness, you may trying out. You may like traveling to newer places, or try new food, uh, new delicacies. Then comes the dimension of intellect, the fifth subdimension. And when we are talking about intellect, we are not again talking about their intellectual ability, which would be IQ or intelligence. Um, Here we are talking about their preference. So people who tend to score high on the intellect subdimension, they like to engage in abstract thinking, in theories. So of course, there is a positive correlation between the openness personality trait and IQs, but these correlations are not too strong. So here we are not talking about intellectual ability, but um, the interest that you may have in intellectual pursuits. Okay. Finally, we have the dimension of liberalism. And here by liberalism, we do not mean the political affiliations, although there is a slight positive correlation there. But we mean that people who tend to be high on liberalism, they tend to be unconventional. They prefer things that are not conventional in nature. They like to break the mold. At least that's what their preference is. So these are the 6 subdimensions of openness. Now, if this was overwhelming for you, we can talk about openness just from the perspective of 2 subdimensions. So when we are talking about just 2 subdimensions, one is called openness, which is this preference for creativity and aesthetic kind of activities, and the second is intellect, which is the preference for abstract ideas, abstract concepts. So we can talk about openness just from this broad perspective. Now, the openness dimension may seem very positive dimension, and in many ways, yes, but all these big 5 personality factors have a positive side as well as a dark side. Okay, so even though it seems like being high on openness is a good thing, and I would say generally it is, but being too high can be problematic, right? Imagine you are very high on openness and you are on a job that is very menial in nature, that doesn't give you any avenue for creative thinking, then you will be frustrated, um, right? So depending on this situation, remember the interaction model for personality. So your personality traits are interacting with the environment in which you are. So the openness personality trait may be a great match in certain environments, but in certain other environments, somebody with low openness may be a better match, or maybe a poorer match. In other words, the value of any personality trait would be determined based on the environment that the person is existing in. Okay. The next trait that we will talk about is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be thorough, organized, controlled, dependable, and decisive. So people who tend to be high on the conscientiousness dimension, they tend to be people who work hard, uh, they do not run away from work. Okay, and whatever work that they are working on, they like to do a thorough job of it. They also tend to be very organized individuals, so they try to keep everything systematic. Because of this hard-working nature, because of they being very organized, they become very dependable individuals, right? And you would depend on such a person. This would be a person who would keep his promise. Uh, so that's broadly what we refer to when we are talking about the conscientiousness personality trait. If we delve deeper by going through the facets of conscientiousness, the first facet is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy, you would remember from your psychology classes. It's the confidence that you have to accomplish a task. Okay. Now, because these are hardworking individuals, they would naturally also have more confidence. They have confidence in their hard work, and consequently that through hard work they will be able to accomplish whatever task that they are working on. They tend to be orderly individuals, the second subdimension. As I mentioned, they tend to be organized. So if you go to their rooms or their offices, you will see that everything is properly organized, everything is kept in their respective places. You don't see much mess around. Or even if you look at the computers, they may have proper to-do lists. Everything is organized, systematic. So that's the tendency that people would have who are high on orderliness. The people who are low on it would be messy, disorganized, don't know where they have left something. So that's the orderliness dimension. Then the dutifulness facet refers to they having a sense of duty, a sense of obligation for whatever it is that they're working on. They feel it is their moral responsibility to get things done, whatever it is that they have taken the responsibility for. The fourth subdimension is achievement striving. So they tend to be, as I mentioned, hardworking individuals, but they are working to achieve goals, whatever goals that they have. So they strive to achieve in their lives. So that's what we mean by achievement striving. Somebody who would be low on this facet would be not caring about what happens in life, not having any ambition. So that would be somebody who is low on this achievement striving subdimension. The fifth subdimension is self-discipline. So they tend to be very disciplined individuals. Whatever it is they think that needs to be done to better themselves, to better their lives, to enhance the chances of their success, they stick to those discipline, right? Whatever it is that needs to be done, they have good willpower. They don't easily succumb to temptation. So that would be self-discipline. And the last subdimension is cautiousness or deliberation. So these individuals, they tend to be very deliberative in their thinking. They analyze things before taking any major decision, as opposed to impulsively jumping on something. Okay. So by cautiousness, it's not that they are scared of possible outcomes. So the scared part would be associated with neuroticism. That's a separate personality trait. But it's referring more to do with not being impulsive, being deliberate, systematic in one's analysis, and then making a decision that would be good for the person or for the organization. So that's what we mean by the cautiousness or deliberation subdimension. So those were, of course, the six subdimensions, six facets. If we talk about conscientiousness at a simpler level with only two subdimensions, then those would be industriousness, which is nothing but hard work. Now, and hard work towards achievement of a goal. So they can sustain their hard work. They persist. They don't easily give up. They are very industrious individuals. And the second part is orderliness, which I have mentioned a lot. So they tend to be organized, systematic, which I've already mentioned. So industriousness and orderliness, these are the two main subdimensions of conscientiousness. So similar to openness, this seems like a very positive trait, and yes, it is. It is a trait that is associated with success in life. It is a trait that is also associated with happiness in life, because you tend to be happier when you achieve things. So even in marital satisfaction, if you are married to a conscientious person, the likelihood of your marriage lasting becomes longer, because such a person wouldn't cheat, because he has this dutifulness subdimension, for example, which I spoke of. And this person would have a lot of self-discipline, lot of willpower as to not succumb to temptations. So you can realize how these dimensions, these different personality traits may affect different spheres of your life. Now, but as I was mentioning, the actual benefit of the personality trait comes when there is a match with the environmental demands. So in certain situations, now actually being low on conscientiousness may actually be helpful, right? What's that story of ant and the grasshopper, right? The ant would be a very conscientious person, right? Example of the conscientiousness trait. But the grasshopper person this grasshopper has actually low conscientiousness, not working, doesn't care. And in the story, of course, it ultimately benefits the ant because he had worked hard, he had saved food. But imagine situation where there is a lot of uncertainty. Imagine situations where or like you are living in Venezuela or some country where your efforts are not recognized, or the money that you save may just vanish tomorrow. So in those circumstances, being that conscientiousness may not actually be very beneficial. The person who is actually not conscientious may actually benefit more because he didn't work hard, he didn't waste all his effort trying to build up something that gets lost or that vanishes into thin air overnight. So in any case, there can be lot of facets that we could discuss, but we will discuss these things more in context of leadership. So we will stop our discussion on conscientiousness here. The next personality dimension would be extroversion, which is the tendency to be sociable, assertive, and to have positive energy. So people who are high on this dimension, they tend to be called extroverts. Who are low on this dimension, they tend to be called introverts. People who are high on this dimension, they tend to be social individuals. They like interacting with people. They also tend to be more assertive. Assertive, especially verbally. They are very they don't hesitate expressing whatever it is they are interested in. And these individuals, they tend to have a lot of positive energy as well, meaning that they have a tendency to experience positive emotions. Now, this does not mean that the introverted individual experiences negative emotions. No. Introverted individuals have a lower tendency to experience positive emotions. So when we are talking about negative emotions like anger, jealousy, envy, we are actually talking about a completely different personality trait, which is neuroticism. So when we are talking about extroversion, we are talking about our tendency to experience more positive emotions like joy, happiness, being cheerful. So people who tend to be high on the extroversion dimension, they tend to be more joyful, they tend to be more cheerful individuals, they tend to like interacting with people. Uh, who are lower on this dimension, the introverted individuals, they have a lesser tendency to experience those positive emotions. They tend to be a little less social, or if they are strongly introverted, then completely asocial. So let's quickly go through the subdimensions again. Friendliness or warmth, the words should be self-explanatory. They tend to be very friendly individuals. They exude a lot of warmth, and that is the reason they easily make friends. Extroverted individuals. Gregarious individuals, um, meaning they tend to like interacting with people in large group setups. So they don't feel conscious, they don't feel, in fact, they like the limelight of being in large group. So they enjoy that. So they tend to be very gregarious individuals. Assertiveness, so they tend to be assertive in their expression of their interests. What is it they want? They express that verbally really well. They tend to have a lot of positive energy, activity level positive energy. They tend to um, seek excitement. So mm, they uh, they like excitement. If there isn't enough excitement, they get easily bored. Okay, introverted individuals will be comfortable uh, being in a boring situation, but uh, an extroverted individual uh, would always be seeking excitement. That's the reason they may go to parties more often. Okay, um, whereas the introverted individual will be comfortable sitting at home and maybe reading a book. Clear? The last subdimension would be cheerfulness. So as I said, they exude a lot of positive emotions. So they tend to be generally more happy, generally more um, expressive also with their emotions, positive emotions especially. If we talk about extroversion from these two facet model, then enthusiasm is the first facet, which is spontaneous joy and engagement. So nothing but the tendency to experience more positive emotions. And assertiveness is the second subdimension, which is similar to what I have already mentioned in context of the six facets. So this is the extroversion dimension, and this is probably the dimension that most people are familiar with because the term extroversion, introversion has become essentially very common in the popular culture. And we will again discuss the relevance of this dimension to leadership once we finish talking about all the big five personality traits. The next dimension is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be accepting, conforming, trusting, and nurturing. So people who are high on the agreeableness dimension, they tend to be very trusting individuals. And by that, I mean that they trust people easily. I'm not saying that they are trustworthy individuals. They could be, but being trustworthy means you can depend on somebody. The somebody who is a trustworthy person means that you can rely on this person, you can depend on this person. And that is, if you would remember, associated with the conscientiousness dimension. When we are talking about trusting here, we are referring to the person easily trusting others. Okay, uh, so that's what we mean by trusting here. People who are high on agreeableness, they are also very nurturing individuals. They like to help others. They like to be invested in the growth of others. They tend to be accepting of other people's faults. Um, so that's broadly what we mean by agreeableness. If you are low on the agreeableness dimension, you don't trust people easily. You are like a Machiavellian personality. You are manipulative. Um, you, if I take the extreme case of somebody being really low on agreeableness, that would be a person who is a jerk or an asshole, uh, doesn't care about anybody. So that would be the lower end of agreeableness. Now, if we talk about agreeableness dimensions, the facets, the 6 facets, the first one is trust, which of course I've already mentioned about they being trusting individuals. The second one is morality or straightforwardness, and by that we don't mean morality in the strictest sense. Rather, what's meant here is that they tend to be straightforward. They express things the way they are. They are not trying to hide or manipulate things. So people who are low on this subdimension are these Machiavellian individuals. They manipulate. They are not straightforward, uh, right? They hide their intentions if you are low on this subdimension. If you are high on this dimension, you openly mention your intention. So you are straightforward in your approach. The third subdimension is altruism, which is nothing but being helpful. They like to help others, which I have already mentioned. The fourth subdimension is cooperation, compliance. So these people who are high on agreeableness, they are comfortable and they like actually cooperating with others because they are not giving themselves as much importance as they're giving to others. Probably because of that, they like to work around with people. So the opposite of this would be they being very competitive. So somebody who is low on agreeableness would be very competitive. He or she would be engaging in cutthroat competition and maybe willing to hurt you to get ahead, right? So that's the cooperation compliance dimension. Of course, if you are on the extreme cooperation end, then you may end up becoming a pushover, right? So that would be the cooperation subdimension. Then the fifth subdimension is modesty. So they do not like to brag about themselves. Of course, if you are lower on this dimension, then you would be the person who is bragging and who is all, too ego invested, talking about self. So that's the modesty dimension. And finally, sympathy or tender-mindedness. So this dimension refers to being attuned to the suffering of others, being able to understand the pain of others, being able to feel other people's difficulties, their pain, and then wanting to help them. Okay, so these are the subdimensions of agreeableness. If we talk about only 2 subdimensions, then compassion, which is nothing but the tendency to be empathetic towards other people's needs, to care for others. So that's one. And the second subdimension is being polite. So you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and you conform to the interpersonal norms. You are not nasty. Like the opposite of politeness would be the person who is an asshole, right? Who is really nasty, doesn't care about your feelings. So these are the 2 sub-dimensions of agreeableness. And we will see the connection of agreeableness to leadership later on. So the last big 5 personality trait left for us to discuss is neuroticism, which is the tendency to be depressed, anxious, insecure, vulnerable, and hostile. In simple words, neuroticism is the dimension referring to people's tendency to experience negative emotions, or most negative emotions, if not all. And people who are low on neuroticism, they have lesser of a tendency to experience negative emotions. Okay, so it's not that they are happy. If we are talking about happiness, then or experiencing positive emotions, then we would be talking about the extroversion dimension, right? So when we are talking about neuroticism, we are talking about the tendency to experience negative emotions. One thing to keep in mind, the term neuroticism may give the impression of this being a psychopathology, somebody being diagnosed with neuroticism. But that's not what we are referring to here. We are talking about the personality dimension. We are not talking about the psychopathology called neuroticism. In other words, we all are neurotic to varying extent. We are talking about the personality trait of neuroticism. So if we discuss neuroticism in a little greater detail, so there is the tendency to experience anxiety, which is a negative emotion. So these people, they tend to get easily anxious. They have a tendency to get easily angry, hostile, right? Hostility could get manifested in form of envy as well. So you are easily envious of other people. They have a tendency to easily get depressed. People who are high on neuroticism. Again, we are not talking about clinical depression where you are diagnosed with depression, but we are talking about the personality trait where you have a greater tendency to feel sad, to get into this low depressive mood. The fourth facet is self-consciousness, which is you being too conscious of self, about how other people view you. You are worried about it, and that could then manifest in form of you not wanting to interact in certain social situations because you are too worried about how you are coming across to other people. Okay. The next one is impulsiveness or immoderation. Now, of course, you would remember that in conscientiousness, we also talked about impulsiveness, where high conscientiousness was associated with low impulsiveness, right? You deliberated upon things and did not take impulsive decisions. Now, impulsiveness can also be associated with negative emotions. Like, for example, when you are, feeling unhappy, sad, you impulsively go take some, cookies from your fridge and start munching on it, right? Or you may go start drinking alcohol. So impulsiveness is also associated with how well or poorly you manage your emotions, negative emotions. So that's how the impulsiveness dimension comes here. And once you get into it, you are not being able to control. You continue to eat those sweets even more, or you find it difficult to stop. So that's what we mean by impulsiveness here. The sixth facet is vulnerability to stress. Okay, stress again is negative emotion. So if there is any demanding condition, you are more vulnerable to feeling stressed. Somebody who is low on neuroticism may not get as easily stressed. So you can see that all here are negative emotions, and when we are talking about neuroticism, we are talking about people's tendency to experience these different negative emotions. If we talk about the two-factor model or two-facet model of neuroticism, the first one is withdrawal, which is the tendency to avoid in the face of uncertainty. If there is some kind of uncertainty, that makes you uncomfortable, that makes you very stressed, and consequently you avoid any situations where there is possibility of failure or where you don't know what's going to happen. So that's withdrawal. You withdraw. And the second subdimension or second dimension is volatility, which is the tendency to be easily get angry, easily get upset about things, irritable. Again, you are noticing it's about these negative emotions. So that's the neuroticism dimension. The next question is, how are these big five personality traits distributed in the population? And the answer is they tend to be normally distributed. And you would remember what a normal distribution is from your statistics classes or from our discussion on IQ scores. IQ scores tend to follow a normal distribution, right? Now, the big five personality traits may not follow the exact same normal distribution as that of the IQ scores, but the overall pattern tends to be same. In other words, you will find smaller percentage of people with extreme scores on any of these dimensions, and majority people having scores closer to the average, closer to the means of any of these dimensions. If I take the example, say, of neuroticism, you will find a much smaller percentage of the population with extremely high neuroticism scores. On the other end as well, you will find very small percentage of the population that are really low on neuroticism, or in other words, who are extremely emotionally stable. I forgot to mention this while I was talking about neuroticism, but emotional stability is the other end of neuroticism dimension. Okay, the way the extroversion dimension has extroverted individuals on one end and introverted individuals on the other end. So extroversion on one end, introversion on the other end for the same extroversion dimension. Similarly, when we are talking about emotional stability or neuroticism, they are not different personality traits, but rather opposite ends of the same continuum. So on one end you have neuroticism and on the other end you have emotional stability. Somebody who is highly emotionally stable automatically means is low on neuroticism. Somebody who is high on neuroticism automatically means is low on emotional stability. They are just opposite ends of the same continuum. In any case, so majority people though would be either moderately low on the neuroticism dimension or moderately high on the neuroticism dimension. You get the idea, right? So similar kind of pattern is what we will find across the other personality traits as well. Now, this leads to the question of whether we see different distribution patterns for different people, different groups of people, like gender, for instance. Now, if you believe in blank slate equalism, that there are no differences in males and females except for their genitalia, then there should be no differences. But it turns out that there are some statistically significant differences, not on all the personality traits, but on some of the personality traits. It's the same as height, for example. Males generally tend to be taller than females. They tend to be bigger individuals than females. Does not mean that all males are taller than females, right? There could be a woman who is way taller than the average male, right? So we will have exceptions, but if we take the overall average of height of males and females in the population, we will find that the average or the means for males would be higher than that of the females. We see similar kind of differences also on certain personality traits. And the ones where we see the biggest difference are agreeableness and neuroticism. So on both these dimensions, agreeableness and neuroticism, males on an average score lower than females. In other words, females tend to be more agreeable than males. Females tend to be more neurotic or less emotionally stable than males. That's the overall pattern. Now, of course, why do we see these differences? One could explain this based on numerous theories, but the evolutionary reasons tend to be the most satisfactory reasons. So females are responsible for child rearing, for giving birth and taking care of the child, which means then they need to have that quality of being able to care for another individual, the quality of being able to nurture another individual. So that is the reason overall you see they tend to be higher on the agreeableness dimension. Similar kind of reasoning has also been provided for neuroticism, for instance, because they tend to be physically weaker than males. They tend to be much more, so evolutionarily females are built to be much more perceptive of danger. So that is the reason anxiety is in a way it protects you from potential danger, right? So that is the reason we tend to see female scoring overall higher on the neuroticism dimension as well. So we do see some differences on some dimensions, although not all of these personality dimensions. In any case, now we will discuss how these big 5 personality traits are related to leadership. But before I share what research tells us about the connection between these big 5 personality traits and leadership, I want you to pause the video here and rank order the big 5 personality traits in terms of their relationship with leadership. So rank 1 would be the personality trait that you think would be most strongly associated with leadership. Then comes rank 2, 3, 4, 5. The rank 5th would be the personality trait that would be least strongly associated with leadership. Get the idea? Pause the video, rank order yourself, and then you can watch what research tells us about how these personality traits are related to leadership. As I have mentioned before, there are numerous studies that have been done examining the relationship between the big 5 personality traits and leadership. And you would imagine that these different studies may show different results. So how do we figure out the exact nature of the relationship between the big 5 personality traits and leadership? One way to approach is to take a look at what we call our meta-analytic studies. So the result that I'm sharing here is from a 2002 meta-analysis published by Tim Judge and his colleagues. Meta-analysis, if you don't know, it does essentially a quantitative summary of the all other studies that have been done on the same subject. Now, it is not just a mathematical average of those correlations. It's much more complex than that. It's actually the actual process is extremely complex, but the way to think about it is that it essentially does an average of all those studies. But it takes into account the sample size of each of those studies, what all variables have been studied in those studies. It takes into account the reliability scores of those measures in different studies. Not all studies may be equally reliable, right? So taking into account multiple factors, and analyzing all that data from those different studies, we then come to a conclusion about what is likely to be the real relationship between any two variables. And in this context, it's between the big 5 personality traits and leadership. So without delving too much into this technical discussion, let's focus on the relationship. So first thing that we see is that we find a strong relationship between the personality traits and leadership. And when it comes to the big five personality traits, the most strongly associated trait turns out to be extraversion. Then it is conscientiousness. That's the second most related factor with leadership. Next comes openness. Next is neuroticism, but it's related negatively, right? So the more neurotic you are, the less likely you will be a leader, or the less likely you will be effective as a leader. So it's negatively related. If we instead of the term neuroticism, if we use the term emotional stability, then it would be a positive relationship. So the more emotionally stable you are, the more um, likely you are to be a leader, and more likely you are going to be effective in your role of leadership. And the last dimension is agreeableness. So this is the trait that is least related to leadership, or it is the correlation is still positive, but the correlation is weak. Okay, so it is weakly related to the idea of leadership. Let's take a look at one of the original tables from Judge's paper. Now, if you are not trained in statistics, this table can, of course, be overwhelming. So, to make things simple, I will ask you to focus only on this column, row. The numbers that you see here actually are the correlations between the big five personality traits and leadership. Okay. So, what do we see here? We see here that extroversion is the most strongly associated with leadership, with the correlation of 0.31, followed by conscientiousness, 0.28, followed by openness, 0.24, followed by neuroticism in the negative direction, also 0.24, and the trait that is the least correlated with leadership is agreeableness, with a correlation of 0.08. Now, it is not exactly zero, but the correlation is weak. I'm saying it is not zero because the confidence intervals are still in the positive direction, but that's going into technicalities. So the trait that is very weakly correlated with leadership is agreeableness, and the trait that is most strongly correlated with leadership is extroversion. Now, depending on what your personality traits are, this can be real great news for you, or it can be disheartening. For example, if you are an introverted person, let's say you are, strongly introverted person, this result can be very disheartening because you don't seem to have the trait that makes leaders, right? Let's say you are an introverted person and very agreeable. That's again, problematic, right? Because agreeableness is not very strongly associated with leadership. Or let's say you are a person high on neuroticism. Again, that would be very disheartening because that is negatively associated with leadership. So you get the idea. Depending on what your personality traits are, um, this table, this results can either make you feel good about yourself or can make you feel a little frustrated, especially if you are aspiring to be a leader, if you are aspiring to be an effective leader. So how do we make sense of this data? That's what I will focus my discussion on next. Actually, before we move into that discussion, let's take a look at one of the other tables from Judge's paper, because it gives some deeper insights into the connection between the big five personality traits and leadership. So you would remember we had discussed leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness. These are different things. emergence refers to whether or not you are likely to emerge as a leader in kind of informal setup. So the more people perceive that you have leader-like qualities, they will be much more willing to follow you. That is what leadership emergence is. Whereas when we are talking about leadership effectiveness, we are talking about you already being in the role of leader and achieving the goals for the organization or having highly satisfied subordinates. So that's how, those are the two major ways that we measured leadership effectiveness. So in this table, we see the connections or the relationship that the big five personality traits have with emergence and effectiveness. Now, one thing you would notice is that the correlations between the big five personality traits and emergence is stronger than the correlations that you see between the big five personality traits and effectiveness. And this is something hopefully you remember from my last presentation on the topic. So personality traits have a stronger effect on leadership emergence than they have on effectiveness. They do have a strong effect on effectiveness as well, but the effect relatively is stronger on leadership emergence. Now, if we take a look at the specific patterns, we see extroversion as well as conscientiousness, both having a strong impact on leadership emergence. In other words, if you are an extroverted individual or if you are a conscientious individual, people are likely to perceive you as somebody who has leadership qualities and will be willing to follow you. The next trait is openness. So if you are high on openness, creative, imaginative kind of person, that would also be associated with people willing to follow you. If you are highly neurotic, then people will not follow you. Or in the opposite end, if you are very stable, emotionally stable, people will be willing to follow you. Agreeableness, the correlation is really weak, close to zero. So doesn't seem to have much effect on whether or not people will be following you if you are highly agreeable. Now we see slightly different pattern when it comes to effectiveness. We see that extroversion and openness tend to have a stronger effect on actual effectiveness of leaders. Neuroticism with a score of minus 0.22 is the next most important factor. So if you are highly neurotic, you will not be effective as a leader. Agreeableness turns out is helpful actually with respect to effectiveness, right? And you would imagine probably the effectiveness would be more to do with the satisfaction of the employees because agreeable individuals will be caring, but agreeableness could also help in achievement of the goals as well, right? Because if you care for your employees, people then may be motivated to work harder, and ultimately that could help in the achievement of the goals. Conscientiousness, of course, if you are yourself very disciplined, hardworking person, that can help in your achievement of goals. But leadership is more about working, getting your employees, getting your followers to work hard. So again, the correlations are actually strong. I don't want to give the impression that conscientiousness does not matter for leadership effectiveness. It does. Correlations are still very strong. But relative to the other traits, we see that the correlation is slightly lower here. So this is the overall pattern that we are observing between the big five personality traits and leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness. Many people who are not very familiar with statistics may not be able to appreciate all those correlations, those numbers that I shared with you. So let's approach this from a slightly different perspective. If we give the big five personality test to the entire American population, and if we pick one of those big five personality traits, extroversion, because that's the most strongly associated with leadership, right? From those correlations that we saw. So let's talk only about extroversion, also in interest of time. If we take the average extroversion score for the entire population, it's likely to coincide with the median because it's the big population. And we will actually have two groups of people who have scores higher than the mean and who have scores lower than the mean. So those who have scores higher than the mean, we could call them extroverted. Those who have scores lower than the mean, we can call them introverted individuals. Now, somebody slightly higher than the mean, is he really extroverted? Well, that's arguable, maybe just mildly extroverted. But we will have about 50% extroverted, 50% introverted in the population. Now, how do you think the distribution is going to be amongst leaders? Do you think in the leadership population, we will have a higher percentage of extroverted individuals than introverted individuals? Yes? If you do, you are right. But how much higher? Is it going to be 50-50, 60-40, 70-30? How do you think it's going to play out? It turns out that the percentage of extroverted individuals who are in managerial positions or leadership executive positions is way higher. It's about 95-96%. Only 4 or 5% tend to be introverted individuals. Now, if we take a look at people who are highly extroverted, because some of these people may not be highly extroverted, they may be just mildly extroverted, a score of 51 as opposed to 49. We could argue they are not really extroverted individuals, right? That's the discussion that we have had also in context of the MBTI, you would remember. If we are talking about highly extroverted individuals, we will find not 50%, but smaller percentage, say about 25% of the population who are highly extroverted. But if you go to the supervisors level, you will find about 50% of them tend to be extroverted. You go to the first level manager, first line manager who are above the supervisors, 57% of them tend to be extroverted or highly extroverted. Middle level manager, 64% tend to be highly extroverted. You go to executive level, 74% of them tend to be highly extroverted. And if you go to top level management, 80% of them tend to be highly extroverted. So depending on whether you are an introverted person or highly extroverted person, this could be either great news for you or disheartening, right? This graph tells us a lot of stuff. If you are a very extroverted individual, you are much more likely to be perceived as having those leader-like qualities, and you are much more likely to go to top management. But if you are an introverted person, then you seem to be at a disadvantage. So how do you deal with this? If you are an introverted person, are you doomed that you cannot be an effective leader or you cannot emerge as a leader? It may seem like that, but if we do a deeper analysis, and especially this is the kind of analysis that you see in some of the recent papers, some of the recent studies that have been that are being done on the topic of personality traits and leadership, we will find that no, this may not necessarily be your introversion may not necessarily be a death sentence. Of course, it is true that extroversion would give you certain advantages, but we need to see things from a slightly different perspective. We can't only think of extroversion. We also have to take into account other personality traits. Okay, you are an introverted person, but are you emotionally stable? Are you a highly conscientious individual? Are you high on openness? So we have to take those factors into account as well. Well, if you are at a disadvantage on all those personality dimensions, then yes, probably you will not make a leader, or if you do, you will not be very effective as a leader, right? But one thing to keep in mind is that you should not only be considering just one dimension. That's point number one. Point number two, people actually have a lot of misconceptions about extroversion. So that's what I want to touch upon next. People have all kinds of ideas about extroverts and introverts, and many of those ideas are actually incorrect. They are not factually correct. So, of course, there are a lot of myths, but here I have enumerated a few that are related to leadership. It's not true that extroverts always make for better leaders than introverts, and I will explain this through a couple of studies. It is also not true that introverts are plagued by public speaking anxiety. Just because somebody is an introverted person does not mean that this person has public speaking anxiety. Anxiety, you would remember, is associated with which trait? With neuroticism. So if somebody actually has high anxiety, it could be more strongly associated with the trait of neuroticism than with respect to extroversion, introversion. Clear? Another myth is this idea that extroverts get their energy from social interaction, whereas introverts get their energy from privately reflecting on their thoughts and feelings. This is actually half truth. This is, I don't know, it's very popular in this amongst people, this myth that extroverts get their energy from interacting with people, whereas introverts get the energy by sitting quietly. It is only half truth in the sense that yes, extroverts get their energy from social interaction, but so do introverts. There is a slight difference here, and it has a lot of implications as well, which I will explain in the next slide with some figures. In this graph on the x-axis, we have level of arousal or stimulation. The more social interaction you are having, the more social attention you are getting, the more aroused your brain is. Okay. On the y-axis, we have hedonic tone. Positive hedonic tone would mean you are finding the interaction pleasant, pleasurable. Negative would mean you are finding the interaction unpleasant. Indifference means what? You don't care. So what do we see here? We see that both for the extroverted individuals as well as for the introverted individuals, the increased level of social interaction or increased level of arousal leads to they feeling that interaction pleasant, more pleasurable. It's increasing both for the extroverted individuals as well as for the introverted individuals. So remember, it's not that only extroverted individuals find social interaction pleasurable. Even introverted individuals too. They both find it pleasurable. But the key difference is introverted individuals reach their limit sooner than the extroverted individuals. Now, the numbers that I'm giving here are arbitrary, but say an introverted individual may be able to engage in that social interactions for about 2 hours, after which the person he reaches his upper limit. Beyond that, when the interaction happens, it ceases to be less pleasant. And if it continues, say beyond 4 hours, now it becomes unpleasant. Okay. In contrast, the extroverted individual would reach the limit a little later, maybe say 4 hours instead of 2 hours, what we saw for the introverted individual. So the extroverted individual then may, after 4 hours again, he too will find the interaction less pleasant, and beyond a certain point, he will start finding the interaction less pleasant or unpleasant. So the same pattern follows both for the extroverted individual as well as the introverted individual, which has a lot of implications. This means that it is not that the introverted individuals lack in the ability to interact socially, right? They can interact like the extroverted individual, just that they reach their limit sooner, which then has a lot of practical implications. If you are an introverted person, you can still be an effective leader, but you would need to take breaks. breaks of alone time to recuperate, to get back your energy. So you may say, for example, engage in a lot of social interactions for 2 or 3 hours, but you cannot sustain that level of interaction beyond that point. So you may have to take a short break, 15 minutes of quiet time. And after that, your level of arousal has come down, right? Because you were alone, you had that quiet time. So after that break, when you again start interacting with people, you are again on that upward trajectory. Now, the extroverted individual has the advantage of being able to just interact for a longer period of time. Clear? So, saying that only extroverted individuals can interact and not the introverted individuals is wrong. It's like saying that extroverted individuals cannot sit quietly and read a book, which would be a stupid thing to say, right? Just because extroverted individuals prefer a lot of the social interaction does not mean that they can not sit quietly and read a book. Yes, uh, the introverted individual can be in that quiet state for a much longer period of time before he goes into finding that alone time unpleasant, and even at relatively higher levels of aloofness, loneliness, the extroverted individual will find that unpleasant. So we see some differences, but uh, they still can do things that are different from their preferred tendencies, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The advances that have now happened with respect to brain imaging, with respect to neuroimaging, has helped us understand some more deeper differences that lie between extroverted individuals and introverted individuals. And these differences also have interesting insights with respect to leadership. One thing that we know now is that extroverted individuals, if you are highly extroverted, you are more likely to have a dominant dopamine pathway, which is short. You seek out those interactions and you find that immediate pleasure that when you're seeking out for those social attention. In contrast, the introverted individuals, they tend to have a more dominant acetylcholine pathway that goes through, uh, that's longer and goes through many regions of the brain, okay, which then gives even introverted individuals certain advantages. One advantage is that because it's going through different regions of the brain, the introverted individual may find a deeper sense of meaning from that interaction, and consequently could also provide that deeper sense of meaning to the person, to the people with whom the person he is or she is interacting, right? Whereas in case of the extroverted individual, it could be those quick, easy, just short, fun kind of interactions. You realize this can then have important implications for leadership. It's not that as an introverted individual, you are completely at a disadvantage, because through these deeper connection that you may be able to make with your followers, with your subordinates, you then could become more effective a leader compared to that of an extroverted individual, right? Here's a study by Adam Grant and his colleagues published in 2011 that illustrates the effect of those differences between extroverts and introverts really well, and sometimes how those differences give the introverted individual some major advantages when it comes to leading. So in this study, they were studying the leadership style of leaders in a pizza store, not a pizza store, but a chain of pizza stores. And what they find is that when the pizza stores were led by extroverted individuals, those stores had 16% higher profit. So that's in favor of the extroverted individuals. But there's a twist. When they also measured the personality traits of their employees, and in that personality trait test, they gave there is a trait called proactive. Okay, so proactive individuals are those who tend to take a lot of initiative. They don't wait for somebody to tell them what to do. If they see there's a need for something to be done, they take the initiative, they do those things, which is a very desirable quality, right? That you would like in your employees. It's the proactive trait is fairly correlated with the conscientiousness trait. They have a good correlation there. In any case, what we find here when they do further analysis, they find that the extroverted leaders were actually not very effective with proactive employees. In fact, there was 14% lower profits when the extroverted individuals were leading proactive employees. In other words, the introverted leaders did better with proactive employees. So 28% lower output from employees after extroverted leaders respond to ideas and suggestions. So extroverted leaders, because they prefer being the center of attention, they were not as receptive to also ideas and suggestions that were coming from these proactive employees. Okay, and which would then, of course, make them demotivated, and or at least would reduce their level of motivation, and they will this subordinates will not perform at the optimum level. So the extroverted leader's style does not always work in the advantage of leading, especially when it comes to leading proactive employees. Introverted leaders seem to have a greater advantage when it comes to leading proactive employees. And proactive employees are the kind of people that you would like in your organization, especially in the modern day service organizations, in the knowledge organization, where there is a greater value for proactive employees. There is a likelihood of also there being more proactive employees. The introverted leaders can then have a significant advantage. And you will see the results from this study, as you can see in this graph, show that the introverted leaders, low extroversion would be introverted leaders, they are most effective with the highly proactive employees. That's where the store profits were actually the highest. Whereas the extroverted leaders were more effective with the employees who were not proactive. Now, these researchers, they also repeated the study in the lab, where the task was for the participants to fold t-shirts, pretty menial task, but even there they find the same result pattern. The introverted leaders were most effective with the proactive followers, whereas the extroverted leaders were more effective with the passive followers. So what do we learn here? We learn here that extroversion is not universally effective when it comes to leading individuals. Even though we see that higher correlation, does not mean that extroversion is universally effective. Introverted leaders can also be effective in certain situations. So people who are introverted do not necessarily then are at a complete disadvantage when it comes to leading. Extroverted individuals have their own set of advantages. Introverted individuals have their own set of advantages with different groups of people in different situations. And this is actually the nature of studies that we are doing now. We are not just studying at a broad level how are different traits related to leadership, but we are asking questions like, when is extroversion effective? When is introversion effective, right? Or when is high neuroticism bad or ineffective in leadership? But are there situations where high neuroticism can actually be good or helpful in leadership effectiveness? That's the kind of questions that we are asking. This reminds me, Intel's CEO had written that book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Okay, paranoia would be dealing with more neuroticism, but so negative emotions. But in certain situations, even that can help you be more effective. Now, it may not help you be effective in all spheres of life, but in certain spheres of life, in certain situations, that can be a huge asset. Imagine you are heading the CIA, maybe paranoia may be a very helpful asset there. In any case, we have just crossed the 1 hour 30 minutes mark, so we have gone way over time, but I hope you found this video valuable, and hope you got some benefits from this video. Thank you.